Ghani Chichikan. Well, we're back to Washington, D.C. now. We're joined by Reza Marashi, Research Director at the National Iranian-American Council. Thanks for being with us. Now, this isn't the first time Iran's threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, despite the fact that it'll cripple Tehran's own oil industry. Do you think this time, though, the pressure has built up sufficiently for it to carry its threats through?
I don't think we've reached a point yet where the Iranian government will act on threats that it's made for the better part of 3 decades with regards to closing the Strait of Hormuz. Closing the Strait of Hormuz for the Iranian government would be the equivalent of cutting off its nose to spite its face. It's heavily reliant on its income from oil exports, the vast majority of which go through the strait. That being said, just because it's something that the Iranian government doesn't want to do doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that it won't do if pressure increases to the point where Iran is backed into a corner.
Just remind us, what is the main stumbling block here? I mean, this has gone on for such a long time. There hasn't been agreement between Iran and the U.S. for decades now.
I think the main stumbling block is you have 2 governments that haven't been communicating for over 3 decades, and when you don't have direct channels of communication, that increases the likelihood of miscalculations and misperceptions, and it reinforces a cycle of escalation and conflict, and it institutionalizes an enmity between these 2 countries where, if you're not communicating, that again, it increases the likelihood that you can take actions that might not be in accordance even with your own interests, and rather than governments controlling the conflict begins to control the governments, and we end up with an outcome that I think both parties independently would seek to avoid.
Reza, you touched on this just now, but we've heard opinions ranging from it all being a big Iranian bluff to world peace being at stake, a really big deal. How volatile do you really think the situation is now? And indeed, may it be a mistake that kicks it all off if the worst were to happen?
I do think that it would be a mistake if something were to kick it off, because neither side is looking for a war right now. You have a president in the United States that's up for re-election, and you have an Iranian government that's increasingly unpopular at home, and that really doesn't do well when it has multiple issues on its plate that it has to deal with. But again, that being said, when you have 2 sides, the U.S. and Iran, that have developed over the better part of 3 decades an institutionalized enmity, conflict can oftentimes spiral out of control because you don't have any levers to release the pressure. You don't have any dialogue to communicate with one another. And so a situation of increasing the conflict, a situation of trading barbs, eventually takes on a life of its own. And I think that's where we are now. So if we don't put in place these kinds of mechanisms to de-escalate tensions, then it could very well spiral out of control.
But what is your prognosis? I mean, the U.S. is heading into an election year. Do you think a new president, if there is one, can make a breakthrough in a stalemate that's essentially been, as we've been saying, going on for decades?
I don't think that political parties in the United States dictate the range of options that are available to an American president, and recent history demonstrates that for us. President Obama's Iran policy, as it stands now, really isn't that different than what the Iran policy of President Bush was when he left office. That being said, creating political space and having the political will to pursue diplomacy, which Obama did in the beginning of his administration, isn't necessarily in place now, and I think that's part of what causes this conflict to reach the point that it has now. That being said, there are also issues on the Iranian side that have brought this conflict to the stages of really unprecedented heights, and the Iranian government's not doing anything to make the situation any better either, and arguably it's made the biggest mistake, which was the contested elections in 2009 and the subsequent human rights abuses that have taken place, that in turn took away Obama's political maneuverability that was already limited to begin with. So it becomes a reinforcing cycle where both sides are poisoning the well and backing themselves into a corner, and they don't have a lot of political maneuverability to get out right now. So it's going to take somebody really brave, both in Tehran and in Washington, to take a stand for peace. And I hope the adults in the room, both in Washington and Tehran, will do exactly that.
Thanks very much for your thoughts. Reza Marashi, Research Director at the National Iranian-American Council.